Hello, everybody, on Thanksgiving Eve. People are a little slow tonight getting logged in, but we'll get everybody there. Sonia, I can't hear you. If you're talking, you have to unmute yourself. But hello. And if somebody could give me a sign that they can hear me.
Thank you.
Oh, there's somebody who hears me. Good. Cool.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good. So today I started sending out a couple of quizzes, and I also sent out tonight's class from the last time we did it, a recording of tonight's class, so you can have it right away. There's a recording coming of the class from last night, not the one we did last night because we had the wrong deck in there of slides, but the one with the correct deck of slides. So we'll hopefully we'll get you guys everything you need to work independently if you're not in class. And of course, we always love to see you in class anyway, so everything should be okay in the long run. The tests, by the way, as you take them, they grade them for you, and then they send the grades to me. That helps me just make sure that you're on track for learning. And think of them more as quizzes than tests. I'm going to send out tomorrow our class final exam. I know some of you have just started and you're not ready. That's okay. You can take it anyway, or you can just play with it. I'm not keeping the grade. I'm not going to hold it later on and make sure you have to average a passing grade. It's just that later on we'll send it out again. And when you pass the final exam, the class exam, then you're ready to go on and take your state exam. And you can take it as many times as you want. The class exam, the state exam, you can take as many times as you want, but you have to pay for it. So you want to make sure you kind of get yourself up to speed on my exams so that you're not paying for them. Any other questions, of course, ask. And tonight is Thanksgiving Eve. Everybody's probably hitting traffic tonight as they're driving. So I expect people to be popping in and out later on. And this is chapter 4 and 5. And this is where the stuff starts to get useful and it gets to be entertaining. It's not as cut and dry as chapter 3. So let's get started. We're going to talk about estates and interests in real property. Remember, there's two kinds of property, real property and personal property. And real property is thought of to be more important than personal property. On real property, if you don't pay your mortgage, your home gets foreclosed potentially. And in New Jersey, it takes 4 or 5 years to foreclose. That's real property. Your car is personal property. If you don't make your payments on your car, probably after a month or two, they come and they repossess your car. So much more quickly is personal property repossessed than real property. Another interesting factoid about real property is when they originally created the United States in the Constitution, the only people who were allowed to vote, it didn't say men only or women only, it didn't say only certain nationality or only a certain race could vote. The only people who were allowed to vote were people who owned real property. So ownership of real property is what determined whether or not somebody had the right to vote. So the founding fathers did believe that the ownership of real property was one of the very most fundamental rights that we had as Americans. And think about why they thought that. Because in England, the crown owned all the real property. The royal family owned all the real property. And think about this. In China today, the Chinese government owns all of the real property. When you have a building in China, you don't own your land. The Chinese government owns your land and gives you either a 50 or a 99-year lease. So the ownership of real property is extremely important, and it's a fundamental right according to our founding fathers, and it's more significant than owning personal property. So when we talk about real property, we talk about land, which is the Earth's surface. And land as the Earth's surface is to the center of the earth below and to the heavens above and all things attached by man or nature. So our land, which is defined as the Earth's surface to the center of the earth below and to the heavens above and all things attached by man or nature. So again, we can have trees attached by nature, they're real property. We can have a house attached by man, that's real property. We can have a fence permanently attached to our land, that becomes part of the real property. We have the rights to the minerals that grow or are present beneath our land. We have the right to the oil that's present beneath our land. And we have the right to the airspace to the heavens above. Now, there is an act of Congress that says the airspace to the heavens above is not able to be regulated by individuals. That's a really funny thing because it means airplanes can fly over your house. Airplanes have the right to fly over your house. And what makes it strange today is it actually gives the right for drones to fly over your house. And now think about that. If you own to the heavens above, but there's drones flying over your house, you probably would like to not let them fly over your house, but you can't because air travel is not regulable according to a law that was passed by Congress. But we do own to the heavens above. Airspace is a very valuable commodity. There are apartment buildings that are on top of the major Deegan Expressway after you cross over the George Washington Bridge. And that's because somebody owns the airspace above the highway to build apartments on. So airspace is part of your rights of real property ownership. So we're going to throw in some stuff you probably never thought about. And this is one that's always on the test. And this is riparian rights. Riparian rights have to do with the real property rights that are associated with flowing water. And when we talk about riparian rights, flowing water, think of ripples on a stream. So when you have ripples on a stream, that has to do with riparian rights. And riparian rights have to do with where the ownership occurs. Does it occur at the riverbank or the stream bank? Does it occur at the center line of the stream? And who's allowed to use the stream? That's all part of riparian rights. So think of ripples on a stream for riparian rights. And then we also have rights that are associated with larger bodies of water, like oceans and like large lakes. Those rights that are associated with larger bodies of water are called littoral rights. And the way I like to remember this is think of litter on the beach. So littoral rights are rights that are associated with larger bodies of water that have a beach, like a lakefront, a big lake, or like at the ocean. Those are littoral rights. Riparian rights, think of ripples on a stream. Littoral rights, think of the rights with bodies of water that are affected by the moon. And what bodies of water are affected by the moon? Well, the moon causes high and low tides. So bodies of water that are affected by tidal currents, high and low tides. There's another term that we have to be familiar with. And yes.
Hi, Bruce. Would you be able to move the slides according to the lesson, please?
Okay.
Thank you.
Navigable waterways is another term we have to be, and again, if the slides are not moving, let me know. Let's go back to navigable waterways. Navigable waterways are rights that are associated with waterways that are.
Yeah, the slides are not moving.
Okay, let's see what I can do to fix that. Okay, so we should be on the navigable waterways slide. Let's hope it's going to be moving in a second. Somebody let me know, are we on the navigable waterways slide?
Not yet.
Let's see what's going wrong here. Let's go back and try one more time. Okay, are we on navigable waterways yet?
No.
Holy moly, I have no idea what's wrong here. Let's see if I can figure this out.
It shows chapter 4.
Still showing chapter 4. Let's see. That would mean that would be this.
You have two
And
screens. Maybe you are sharing one of them.
yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out here. Let's see what we can do. All right, that's going to stop our share. And we're going to go back here. And we are going to try to share this one. Are we on navigable waterways yet?
Nothing. Right now, we can see it.
Okay,
it's changing.
okay,
Yes, hi, Bruce.
yes.
Yeah, this is Merva. I don't know if you can see me right now. I just wanted to say thank you and happy Thanksgiving to you and your family for everything you did for me. You know, now I signed up with Coldwell Banker.
Oh,
and,
congratulations.
you helped me with, thank you so much. Thank you for everything. I really appreciate all your help. You've been an amazing teacher.
Okay,
Yeah.
so keep an eye out for our classes on continuing education and our classes on how to do business. But those are separate than the 75-hour licensing classes. And then we'll, you know, if you have some, you know, you get to a spot where you don't feel like you're moving along quickly with your training or or how to specialize certain things, you can watch for some of our classes and, you know, join those classes.
Yes, definitely. I will be in touch, you know, for the continuing ed classes.
Okay, good.
Just want to wish you happy Thanksgiving, happy, healthy for you and all your family. And
All right,
happy
thank you.
Thanksgiving to everybody also.
Same to you. Thank you very
Have
much.
a good night. Thank you.
Good night. Okay, so are we on the navigable waterways slide now?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes,
good. So
actually,
what
yes.
are navigable waterways? I don't know if you remember the Lewis and Clark expedition. The Lewis and Clark expedition went from St. Louis and tried to find a inland waterway to the Pacific Ocean. And that's because Congress said that all navigable waterways are owned by the federal government. So if Lewis and Clark could find a navigable waterway from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean, they could claim all those waterways for the federal government. So navigable waterways are owned by the federal government. If you watch the show Ozarks, that was on Netflix, I think, that they had a riverboat casino on a lake in Missouri. And the reason they were able to have that casino on the lake in Missouri is the lake was defined as a navigable waterway, which meant it was a federal property and didn't belong to the state of Missouri, where gambling was illegal. So, you know, this kind of stuff doesn't sound like much, but sometimes that's, you know, it comes into play. So navigable waterways are owned by the United States government. The next thing we want to talk about, we've got water can add or remove land. Water can do things that adds or removes land. And the slide here says water can add or remove land. We remove land through the process of erosion. So, you know, heavy rains fall, or the hurricanes come and they wash out some of the barrier islands, like in Long Island or like in certain parts of Long Beach Island. They wash out some of the land, and what's left is no longer land. So water can remove land. Water can also add land. The activity of water can also add land. And for some reason, they always have this on the test. So there's a method by which water adds land. The general description of it is called accretion, A-C-C-R-E-T-I-O-N. And accretion means the adding of land by the activity of water. And there is two ways to add land through the activity of water. The first one is alluvion, A-L-L-U-V-I-O-N. And alluvion is the slow, imperceptible adding of land by the activities of water. As an example, the Mississippi River, as it flows down through the center of the country, the nickname of the Mississippi River is Big Muddy, M-U-D-D-Y, because it has a lot of mud and dirt in it. When the Mississippi River hits the Gulf of Mexico, the energy in the water is different because the water in the Gulf of Mexico is not flowing and it's a different temperature. And so all the mud that's in the Mississippi River falls to the bottom and creates land. That's how New Orleans was formed. That's how the Mississippi Delta was formed. That's how the Mekong Delta was formed in Vietnam. All of this stuff was through the activity of water, through the process of alluvion, which is part of an accretion process. The other way we can make land by the activity of water is reliction. Reliction is when we take water and we pump it out, and what's left underneath is now land. So in Holland, all of the Netherlands is below sea level. And the way they have land in Holland, not all of it, but most of the Netherlands is below sea level. The way they have land in Holland is they put up dikes and they pump all the water out, and it's not that deep, and what's left is land. That's reliction. We also did that to make the MetLife Stadium where the Giants and Jets play. That was a body of water at one time, and they pumped out all the water. It wasn't that deep, maybe 40, 50 feet deep, and what was left was land. When they had that land that was left, they gained title to that land through a process called accession, A-C-C-E-S-S-I-O-N. So a lot of words you never heard before here. The activities of water that adds land is called accretion. Forms of accretion are alluvion. Alluvion is a slow, imperceptible deposit of soil. And reliction. Reliction is pumping out the water to leave dirt behind. And if you do either one of those activities and you want to get title to the land, you do it through a process called accession. The next thing is, yes.
The reliction is to pump out?
Yes, is to pump out. So if you have, let's say you have a pond in your backyard and you drain the pond and what's left is land, you gain title to that land through accession, but the process of creating that land is called reliction. The next thing is water sometimes creates boundaries. So let's go back to the Mississippi River again. On one side of the boundary of the Mississippi River, the bank of the Mississippi River will be one state. And on the other bank, on the other side of the Mississippi River, might be another state. So the boundaries of those states were defined by the Mississippi River's flow. Now, when we had Hurricane Katrina and the Mississippi River went from 1 mile wide to 10 miles wide, now the banks were much displaced from their original flow. That did not change the property lines, and that's called avulsion. When you have a change in the flow of a river that defines property lines due to an earthquake or a flood, the property lines do not change, and when the flow goes back to its normal pre-hurricane, pre-flood, pre-earthquake flow, then the lines are the same, and that's called avulsion. The fact that we do not change the property lines temporarily just because the river now is 10 miles wide instead of 1 mile wide. All of these things show up on the test, and you say, well, why? Well, there is a lot of activity in terms of rights surrounding water. And don't forget that up until they invented the steam engine, the main way we transported goods and materials was on waterways. So again, we had to have lots of definitions for the activities of water and how water defines boundary lines and how land is created by the activity of water or taken away by the activity of water. That brings us to the next slide, and I hope you can all see it, where it says private beach. When I was a kid growing up in New Jersey, you weren't allowed on the beaches. The beaches were all privately owned. So a case in 1986 called Bayhead versus Matthews went to the Supreme Court and said that the beaches are really owned by the public. So that's why we're all allowed on the beaches now in New Jersey. You might have to pay a fee to get on the beach because there's a lifeguard, but you can go on any beach you want. And that wasn't the case prior to this law being passed. So Bayhead versus Matthews said that the beaches are owned by the public, not by private entities. And if you go to like Long Beach Island, where the houses are built right up to the beach, you notice they have to have those access ways for the public to get to the beach. Right now, this same court type decision is going on in California. because California hasn't had this same type of a lawsuit for their beaches like in Malibu. And there's people who say those beaches in Malibu should be owned by the public, not by really rich people who own houses along the beach in Malibu. So in New Jersey, it's Bayhead versus Matthews that gave the ownership of the beaches to the public, not to individual private owners. Okay, so now we're going to get talking about real property versus personal property. And again, real property is more significant than personal property, more important than personal property. But one of the weird things is real property can change into personal property, and personal property can change into real property. So they have the ability to go back and forth as to what type of property they are, real or personal. So if you look at the upper left-hand corner, those are trees. And trees are real property. They're permanently attached by nature. They're real property. If you were to cut the trees down, and now we're going to go in a clockwise direction to the picture of the two logs. If you were to cut the trees down and you have two logs, those logs are now personal property. They were real property when they were trees. When you cut them down, they become personal property. And that's called severance. Severance comes from the word like to sever your arteries. You know, if you're going to commit suicide, you sever your arteries. Or if you're breaking up with somebody, you're going to sever your ties with them. You're going to cut your ties with them. So severance means to cut real property down and unattach it. So we started out with trees. We use severance to cut it down and make logs. The logs are now personal property. Now we've taken those logs and we've built a log cabin. So we've reattached those logs again to the earth. So now they become real property again. And now a hurricane comes by and blows down that log cabin, and all that debris that's sitting there is now personal property again. So how does it become from personal property to real? By attaching it, or the way it's affixed. How does it become personal property from real property? By severance, by cutting it, by severance. And that word severance is often on the test. The next thing is a weird kind of loophole, and that's mobile homes. Mobile homes are built in a factory, and mobile homes, when they're in the factory, are personal property. And they're a very special kind of personal property. They're motor vehicles, so that they have a motor vehicle ID number, a VIN number. Mobile homes have a VIN number. Now you tow your mobile home to the mobile home park, and you put a skirt around it, or you attach a deck to it, or you take the tongue off the front of it so that it can't be towed anymore. And now it becomes real property again. See if we have a question here. Now they become real property again. So the question we had, do the beaches, can everybody go on the beach and enjoy the beaches? The answer is yes. What about hotels that are along the beach? In New Jersey, they technically do not have the ability to stop you from going on the beach that's in front of the hotel. Now, that doesn't go for every state, and it doesn't go for every country. But in New Jersey, because of Bayhead versus Matthews, the answer is yes. So you think about it. When you're down at Atlantic City, you can go on the beach anywhere in Atlantic City. When you're at Wildwood, you can go on the beach anywhere in Wildwood. When you're on Long Beach Island, you can go on the beach anywhere on Long Beach Island. It doesn't matter because the public owns the beaches. All right, so let's go back to mobile homes again. A mobile home starts out as personal property when it's in the factory. When it's brought to the site and it's permanently kind of affixed to the property, it becomes real property. Except that mobile homes are originally manufactured as motor vehicles, and they have a vehicle identification number. So even though they're real property and they're attached, and we're considering them real property, that vehicle identification number still kind of designates them as a motor vehicle. And therefore, you cannot sell mobile homes, even if they're permanently attached, on Sundays. Just like you can't sell cars on Sundays. You can't sell mobile homes on Sundays because of a body of laws in New Jersey that are known as the blue laws, BLUE. So a mobile home remains a motor vehicle, even though it's permanently attached, and you can't sell it on Sundays. The next thing is crops. Crops have another loophole. So trees are permanently attached. You plant a tree once and it's permanent until it dies, right? It lasts, I think the oldest tree in the United States is a couple hundred years old. I think the name of it is Methuselah. Crops, on the other hand, you have to plant every year. So trees are real property, but crops, which require annual planting, are the personal property of the person who planted them. So crops are the personal property of the person who planted them. And the reason they are the personal property is because of something called emblement rights. And the reason we have emblement rights is an old concept that goes back to England, and it even has a Latin name, because that's how old it is. The Latin name is fructus industrius. That means from the fruit of your labor, the crops belong to the person who planted them. So what does that have to do with real estate? Well, if you are renting a farm and you plant crops on that farm that you're renting, and the landlord has you evicted, you still have the right to go back and harvest your crops. Even though you were evicted, you still have the right to go back and harvest your crops because of emblement rights through the doctrine of fructus industrius. Trees, of course, are real property because they're permanently attached. Now, sometimes when we're looking at something, we don't really know whether it's real property or personal property. And sometimes things start out as personal property and become real property. And sometimes we have a business where things appear to be real property, but because of this concept of a trade fixture, they are instead personal property. So first, we're going to talk about the tests of a fixture. A fixture is something that started out as personal property and has become real property. And the tests of a fixture is Maria. M is for method of attachment. A is for adaptation of the article. R is for relationship of the parties. I is for intent of the parties. And A is for agreement of the parties, with the exception being a trade fixture. A trade fixture is something that's used in a business that meets the test of a fixture by method of attachment, permanently attached. But since it's in a business and it's permanently attached, it counts as a trade fixture. And trade fixtures are the personal property of the tenant. What does that all mean? So I want to give the example of my son's restaurant. My son was renting a restaurant in New Brunswick that he operated one of his restaurants out of, Fatto Americanos. Inside was a brand new pizza oven, state-of-the-art pizza oven that my son and his partners purchased, and they permanently attached it inside the building. It's a 6,000-pound stove. They have to permanently attach it. Now, when COVID drove him out of business, that stove, even though it was permanently attached and it might have become part of the real property by the test of Maria, method of attachment, because it was used in a business and my son was a tenant in the real property, that stove was a trade fixture. So it was his personal property, so that when his lease was ended, he was allowed to take that pizza oven out and sell it because it was his personal property. His obligation to the real property, however, was he had to repair any holes or any damages or any loose wiring, whatever happened to have when they took that stove out. That stove was a trade fixture, so it was my son's personal property because it was used in a business. So if we're going to go back just to the definition of Maria and what does it mean? Well, if we're looking in Home Depot and we're looking at these pieces on the shelf in Home Depot, when they're on the shelf in Home Depot, they are the personal property of Home Depot. Now you take all those pieces home and you assemble them and you attach it to your house, it becomes real property because of method of attachment. Excuse me. It becomes real property because of method of attachment. So what does this mean? This means that we always have to be aware whether something is real property or personal property. Because if you sell a house, is the assumption going to be that those light fixtures stay with the house? Well, the answer is yes, because they become part of the real property. When did they become part of the real property? When they were permanently attached. And that magical moment when those parts were attached to the house and then became real property is called actual annexation, because the house annexed those parts and made them part of the real property. So that actual moment is called actual annexation. Now think about this for a second. We bought those parts off the shelf at Home Depot. They were personal property. We permanently attached them to our ceiling. Now they're real property. If we tear them out, now they're personal property again. But we've got to be careful when we're doing real estate business, because is the refrigerator real property and therefore should go with the house? Is the stove permanently attached, therefore it's real property and therefore should be included with the sale? Is the washer dryer real property and should be included with the sale, or personal property? And we never really know. So that's where in Maria, the I and the A comes in, because the I is the intent. Was it the intent of the seller to leave the washer and dryer with the house? And if it was the intent of the seller to leave, did the buyer agree with it? Was it the intent of the seller to leave the stove with the house? And was the agreement by the buyer that he was going to accept the stove? Now, I've had people who have put brand new state-of-the-art stoves in a house, and when they go to sell it, they want to take that stove with them. But the stove is permanently attached. Therefore, the buyer would be able to infer that the stove was going to be included in the sale. So the I and the A in Maria say you better express your intent and you better get the buyer to agree. Quite often, especially in Highland Park, we have antique chandeliers in the dining room. And you might have an antique chandelier your great-grandmother purchased 100 years ago, but it's permanently attached to the ceiling. So method of attachment would say that that antique chandelier is real property. In other words, it should be included with the house. And if you don't want to include that chandelier with the sale of the house because it's part of the real property, you would have to indicate your intention. That's the I. You would indicate your intention, and then you would have the buyer agree. And we do that on the listings by having what items are included with the listing. And then a second paragraph after that, what items are excluded from. And I will guarantee you that if you start selling real estate and you get busy, at some point you're going to pay for a washer and dryer or a washing machine or a refrigerator, because you're not going to be careful on what's included and what's not. And so at the walkthrough, you're going to be going through the house and the buyer is going to go, "Where's my refrigerator?" And you're going to have to say, "Whoa, did that refrigerator show as included on the listing or was it excluded?" And sometimes if you made a mistake, in order to get the deal closed, you're going to end up buying a refrigerator. So I don't want you to do that. I want you to be very careful when you fill out your listing agreement, what's included and what's excluded. And when you fill out your offer to purchase, when you're working for a buyer, again, you're going to fill out what's included and what's excluded. Now, in Maria, the second letter is A, adaptation of the article to the real property. And what that means is if something is specifically adapted to your house, then it could count as real property. The most easy way to illustrate this is your front door key. So you can hold your front door key in your hand, but your front door key is actually part of the real property. Why? Because your front door key is specifically adapted to your house. Your garage door openers that you keep on your visor in your car that you push to open your garage doors, they're considered to be part of the real property. That means that when you sell your house, you should include those garage door openers. Why? Because they are specifically adapted to your house to open the doors. Sometimes on the test, they will say that you're selling a house that has a built-in organ. A built-in organ. I don't know why they use organs all the time, but a built-in organ. And there is a specially designed and constructed bench that goes around that built-in organ. And even though that bench can be moved and would appear to be personal property, because that bench is specifically adapted to the real property, to the built-in organ, it might be considered part of the real property. On the test, they ask you a question. There are specially constructed corner bookshelves that are not permanently attached to the property. If they're permanently attached, it's obvious they're real property. Are those specially constructed built-in bookcases real or personal property? Well, most likely they're going to be real property because they're specifically adapted to the house. So again, those are the questions that typically show up on the test. Again, test of a fixture. And that should be the slide we're on now, test of a fixture. Method of attachment, how permanently it's attached. Adaptation, is it specifically adapted? Relationship of the parties, are you a landlord and tenant in a business? Because if you're a landlord and you have a tenant in a business, then you have to be concerned with trade fixtures. Intent of the parties. Are you going to put on your listing that the refrigerator is excluded or included? And then agreement of the parties. When the buyer makes their offer, they're going to write on the contract, I expect there to be a refrigerator there. That's intent and agreement of the parties. Those are the tests of a fixture. Again, we spoke about this a little bit last night when we talk about real property. You should have a picture here of our bundle of rights. Our ownership that's the highest level in New Jersey is fee simple or fee simple absolute. And in a fee simple bundle of rights, those are all the rights that is assumed that you get with your ownership of real property. And the funny thing is, every chapter in the book is really about those rights. Every chapter we get to has something to do with one of those rights of real property. Those are our fee simple bundle of rights. Now, we're on governmental or involuntary limitations on ownership of land. Even though we have our bundle of rights, like the right to use our property for any way we choose, the government can do things to stop us from exercising our bundle of rights. The government can do something to stop us from exercising our bundle of rights. And we give that a man's name. The ability for the government to limit your ownership of real property is PETE, P-E-T-E. PETE is police powers for the P. That means like planning, zoning, and building. Although you have the right to build on your property, the government can tell you how high you can build or what you can build. The E is eminent domain. Although you have the right to sell or not sell your property, if for the good of the kingdom, that's what eminent domain means. If for the good of the kingdom needs your property, they can force you to sell. And we have a chapter later on about eminent domain. Eminent domain is the right to force you to sell. Condemnation is the process. So in PETE, the E is eminent domain. The T in PETE is taxation. You have the obligation to pay real property taxes on your property. And if you don't pay your real property taxes, the government can take your property away from you. This concept of real property taxes goes back a long way, back to the year 50 AD or Common Era, 50 Common Era, paying taxes on real property. And the last E in Pete, P-E-T-E, the last E in Pete is escheat. And escheat is if you die and you don't have a will and you don't have any heirs, no relatives, the property goes to the state of New Jersey and they don't pay anything for it. That's called escheat. So our governmental limitations on the ownership of land that keep us from exercising our bundle of rights that we get when we own land is called PEAT. Police powers, eminent domain, taxation, and escheat. Now we can go even further because we can have other limitations on our ownership of real property. And those other limitations on the ownership of real property, and we should be on the slide that says contractual or voluntary limitations. The other limitations on the ownership of real property are things like deed restrictions, easements, leases, and mortgages. These are voluntary limitations. In other words, you, the owner of the property, have to agree with someone else to have a deed restriction. You, the owner of the property, have an easement that's created either for you or against you through some kind of a voluntary system. Leases, you don't have the right to occupy your property if you've given somebody a lease, because now they have the right to occupy their property. And mortgages means that you're going to allow somebody to take your property away from you if you don't pay them for a loan that you took. So again, these are contractual or voluntary limitations on the ownership of real property. The ones before this were the governmental limitations. That's PEAT, P-E-T-E, police powers, eminent domain, taxation, and escheat. And all of those limit your ability to completely exercise your bundle of rights and do whatever you want with your real property. We're going to throw in some terms now that are going to make the rest of this chapter and the next chapter a little bit more understandable. And we're going to talk about estates and interests. Estates has to do with the duration of your rights with real property, how long those rights are going to last. And interests have to do with how much of your bundle of rights you have. So we can have present interests. That means how many rights you have right now with the property. And we can have future interests. That's how many rights you're going to have sometime in the future. And that's important when we're going to talk a minute about life estates. We also have corporal rights. That means they have body, like a corpse is a body. We have corporal rights and we have incorporeal rights. Incorporeal rights are rights that you can't see or touch or feel, but they're there. They don't have a body. Incorporeal, without body. And then we want to talk about hereditaments. Hereditaments are things that you can inherit. And there are certain types of ownership of real property that you cannot inherit. Most types you can inherit, but there's certain types that you cannot inherit. So hereditaments are things that you can inherit. What does this all have to do with everything? Well, we're going to find out now that there's all kinds of special ways of ownership, all kinds of special circumstances that solve special needs and things that you never thought of, but are very important. And by the way, things that are going to be very important as we move forward with some new taxation plans that are going to go into effect with the current administration. So when we talk about our estates and interests, we're going to talk about the duration and the completeness. If we have a freehold estate, and we should have the slide that says estates and interests, duration plus completeness. If we have a freehold estate A freehold estate is a real property type of ownership, freehold, and it implies an indefinite duration and the completeness of the bundle of rights. So an indefinite duration, it could be forever. We don't know how long it's going to last. And you're going to have all of the bundle of rights. That's a freehold estate. And the highest level of a freehold estate is called a fee simple. Now, if we're going to talk about a freehold, which is, and this slide should say leasehold versus freehold. If we're going to talk about a freehold estate, indefinite duration, completeness of the holding of the bundle of rights. If we're going to talk about a leasehold estate, if you have a lease, your rights to that lease are personal property, not real property. If you have a lease, your rights to that lease are personal property. And when you have a lease, what do you have? If you're the tenant, you have the right of possession. If you are a tenant and you have a lease, you have the right to possess the property for how long? For a definite period of time. So a freehold ownership is for an indefinite period of time, and that's a real property right. A leasehold estate is for a definite period of time. The period of time is your lease, and a leasehold estate is a right in personal property. We have a whole bunch of different levels of estates, freehold and leasehold. Remember, freehold is real property, leasehold is personal property. So we're going to come right down here. These are the freehold ones. These are personal property. And over here on the right are the leasehold ones. You should see the little flow chart that says estates. And the leasehold estates are all named by their duration. Estate for years, periodic estate, month to month, estate at will, and estate at suffrage. They're all named by their duration. On the freehold side, we have fee simple, life estate, fee simple absolute, fee simple defeasible, and leased fee interest. Those are all types of freehold estates that are real property rights. Okay, so now we're going to have to figure out what all this means. Again, a leasehold estate is a temporary ownership of possession by the tenant. At the end of the lease, the tenant has to leave and the right of possession goes back to the landlord. It's a personal property right, and a lease is known as a reversionary interest because it reverts back to the landlord at the end of the lease. And remember, a leasehold estate, which is personal property, is for a definite duration. What's the duration? The time of the lease, the period of the lease. Now, freehold estates, remember we said they're an indefinite duration and they're real property ownership. The highest level of freehold estate is a fee simple or a fee simple absolute. The next level is a qualified fee, and the qualified fee has different names. Could be qualified fee, it could be defeasible fee, it could be conditional fee, it could be fee based on conditions subsequent. We'll explain those all in a minute. And then the last one is a life estate. Now, a life estate is not necessarily less important than a qualified fee estate. So qualified fee or life estate, either one could be second and either one could be third. But the highest level is always a fee simple, also known as a fee simple absolute. So what's the highest level of freehold estate? Fee simple or fee simple absolute. Highest level of freehold estate. The slide that you're seeing now says simply fee simple. Fee simple or fee simple absolute is the highest level of freehold estate. The next level has different names. They all mean the same thing. Defeasible fee, qualified fee, conditional fee, determinable fee. This slide should say defeasible fee and then have the others on the slide. What this means is that you have the real ownership of the property, of the real property, for an indefinite period. We don't know how long it's going to be, indefinite, but it could end if you do something or don't do something. It could end if you do something you promised not to do, or you don't do something you promised to do. Why is it still real property? Because we don't know how long it's going to take you to screw up. You might screw up today, you might screw up in 80 years. My favorite example of this is in East Brunswick, on the corner of Riva Avenue and Hardenberg Lane. There's a big piece of property. 80 years ago, a dead guy in his will left that property to East Brunswick with a qualified fee. And the qualified fee was you have to use it for public education. So East Brunswick built a school on that property. They got the land for free in this guy's will. He said, I'm giving you this land, but you have to use it for public education. So after 80 years, that school was falling apart, had a lot of asbestos. East Brunswick didn't feel like fixing it up, and they sold it to a developer. Probably was the wrong thing to do, but you know, sometimes that's why people go into politics. They sold it to a developer, and the developer was going to build townhouses there. The problem is, as you get a little further down Riva Avenue, the houses start to be $1 million houses, and people who have $1 million houses have money, and people who have money have good lawyers. And so they researched this. And when they found out that 80 years ago, the dead guy left this property to East Brunswick with a qualified fee, a conditional fee that said it had to be used for public education. And as soon as the builder would start building on that property, the ownership would now come away from the builder and go to the heirs of the dead guy who died 80 years ago. And East Brunswick sold it to the builder. Now the builder is screwed, because if he builds on it, he loses the ownership. Why is it a real property right? Because we didn't know how long it was going to take East Brunswick to screw up. It's an indefinite period. The ownership was indefinite. The way they solved this, by the way, was that the title insurance company who insured title for the builder had to pay the claim for the money they paid to East Brunswick. And East Brunswick kept the property, and they built 2 schools on the property. So that's a conditional fee or a qualified fee. And again, what the conditional fee said was, I'm giving you the property as long as you use it for public education. And the reason it's a real property right is we didn't know how long it was going to take for East Brunswick to screw up. It could have been never, or it could have been 2 days, but it was an indeterminate amount of time. Okay. These are used much more often than you think. It's a way of controlling things one step past when you give somebody a property. There's a section of the oceanfront area in New Jersey where there's a defeasible fee that says if you sell alcohol, you lose your ownership of the property. So again, that's a defeasible fee. If you sell alcohol, you lose ownership of the property. Those are real properties, real property rights, because we don't know how long it's going to take you to be stupid and to sell alcohol. The next form of ownership, and let's go back one. The next form of ownership is a life estate. And let's hope this slide is saying life estate and showing you a life estate. A life estate is where you separate the present interests from the future interest. And there's a movie called My Old Lady with Kevin Costner. I'm sorry, Kevin Kline, with Kevin Kline. The premise of the movie is that Kevin Kline's father owned a house worth $1 million in Paris. And when the father died, Kevin Kline inherited the property. And when he went to Paris to claim the property, there was an old lady living in it. And Kevin Klein came to find out that the old lady had been given a life estate by Kevin Klein's father. So the old lady had the present interests and Kevin Klein had the future interests. The old lady had the right to live in the house as long as she was alive. It was also her obligation to pay the taxes and then a type of real estate term that is not to waste. And not to waste doesn't mean keep it in good shape. Not to waste means to make sure there is not a claim of adverse possession against the property. And we'll have a chapter on adverse possession later on. So the old lady was allowed to live in the house as long as she was alive. She had the present interest. Kevin Klein had the future interest. And when the old lady died, her present interests would recombine with Kevin Klein's future interest. And now Kevin Klein would own both the present and the future. And when those combined, the present plus the future, he'd be back to fee simple again. Now, the old lady who lived in the house, she could lease the house and let somebody else live there. But if she died, that person to whom she leased it would have to leave. She could sell the house to somebody and they would have the present interests as long as the old lady was alive. When the old lady would die, then their rights would go away and Kevin Klein would have the present rights and the future rights. So he'd have fee simple ownership again. This is not an uncommon thing. You may have never heard of it, but it's not an uncommon thing because it allows you to control your property a half a step more than giving it away. So like the father in this movie, when he left it in his will, he was able to control the property to give the old lady the right to live in it as long as she was alive. But in the long run, Kevin Klein would get the property. So he was able to control it one half a step. He could have just given it to the old lady, but then he didn't know if she would give it to Kevin Klein when she died. Or he could have given the property to Kevin Klein, but he didn't know if Kevin Klein would let her stay in the property. Many times in real life, this happens where you'll have an older person, 90 years old, 100 years old, living in a house. And those old people always tell you the same thing. I'm not leaving this house until I'm carried out in a casket. So now maybe they need somebody to help them manage and take care of the house. But if they give the house to, let's say, their granddaughter, if they give their house to their granddaughter, that's irrevocable. And the granddaughter may kick them out, or the granddaughter may get married and then live in the house and then get divorced and her husband gets half the house. So how do you control it? What you do is you give your granddaughter the future interests and you reserve the present interest for yourself. So you are allowed to live in the house as long as you're alive. It's your obligation to pay the taxes and not to waste. And when you die, then she gets your present interests to combine with her future interests, which gives her fee simple. But as long as you're alive, your granddaughter can't get you out of the house. So again, this is a method of estate planning that in the olden days was used a lot more than it is today, but it's still very, very prevalent today. And that's a life estate. And we can have these life estates in several different forms. We can have a life estate where the old man, the grantor, gives the old lady the life tenant the estate. And when the life tenant dies, Kevin Klein gets her present interest to recombine with his future interest. In that case, you have an estate in remainder, and Kevin Klein is the remainder man. You can also have an estate in reversion. And let's say the old man didn't die. He just gave the present interest to the old lady. And when the old lady died, her present interest would come back to the old man. That's called an estate in reversion. And then we have one other type. And that type is, let's go up to the first one. We're going to say that the old man gives the old lady the right to live in the house as long as her sister is alive. So we're going to measure the old lady's period of ownership, her present interest. We're going to measure it by her sister's life. And if we're measuring it by her sister's life, we're measuring it by another person's life. And this type of life estate is called a pure, P-U-R, atra, A-T-R-I-V, V-I-E, pure atra V. And what that means is we are measuring the old lady's present interest by somebody else's life. So if her sister passes away, she loses her present interest. All right, and that's a pure atra V estate. These were very common years ago, and they have a lot to do with how high our inheritance taxes are. When Donald Trump changed some of the tax laws, he made it very inexpensive, very low taxes on inheritance. And I think you don't even pay federal inheritance taxes now until you're up to $3 million worth of an estate. It used to be 1.2 million before he changed the rules. And President Biden is talking about changing that back again, to making it so you're going to pay estate taxes at a very lower threshold. And it wasn't President Trump's fault, and it wasn't President Biden's fault, but there was a time when the inheritance tax, get ready for it, was 90%. So if you inherited $1 million, the government took 900,000. That's why rich people created trusts, because they didn't want to have to pay that inheritance tax. Now, our inheritance tax is nowhere near 90%, but there's a lot of talk, especially by the younger people, that we should have a gigantic inheritance tax, because so much of the wealth of baby boomers is going to be transferring as baby boomers die off. All right, that's the end of chapter 4. And that kind of sets up chapter 5, methods of ownership. So everybody should be seeing a slide that says chapter 5, methods of ownership.
One question.
Sure.
The story you told, the old lady has a present interest.
Mhm.
And you mentioned she can sell the apartment or
Mhm.
something like that.
Yep. But
I thought,
if she were to sell it to me, right,
Mhm.
as soon as she died, I would lose my ownership. So would I pay very much for it?
Okay.
No,
Wow.
because if she's 100 years old, she might die tomorrow. Then I get nothing. And in France, by the way, in France, a lot of properties are sold with life estates. That's why the movie was appropriate and, you know, had some significance, because in France, a lot of houses, a lot of real property is sold with life estates, because it's so hard to buy property in France. It's so hard to get, you know, everybody's owned everything for so long.
And she can rent it out as well, as long as she's alive.
Yep. So we had a young lady in class who had gotten evicted from her house she was renting, and she couldn't understand how they had the right to evict her because she'd been paying her rent. And so I helped her investigate it. And what we found out was the woman who rented her the house had a life estate in the house. She didn't have the future interest. She only had the present interest. So she was allowed to rent out the house, and whoever rented it from her, as soon as she died, her ability to rent the house to that person ended, because the ownership went to fee simple absolute to the remainder man. So again, this is not a thing that's that uncommon. I have had a house in New Brunswick over the last year where the family called me to list the house for sale. And I'm looking at the deed because that's where you would see this stuff. And I saw that the owner of the house had reserved a life estate for herself. Now, the owner of the house was in a nursing home and was never coming back to the house. But the problem is, if we went to sell the house and she never died, the people who bought the house, they would not have fee simple ownership until she passed away. So again, we couldn't sell the house while she was still alive, even though she wasn't living there. She did have the life tenancy. She had the ability to live there until she died. And so if somebody were to buy the house and she didn't die, but she miraculously recovered and wanted to move home, they would have to allow her to move back home and they would have to move out. Again, this is a form of control that extends your control a half a step beyond just selling it to somebody and that's it. So it'll be on the test, life estate. They'll talk about pure atrophy for another's life. They'll talk about is an estate in remainder, which means there's a remainder man, or is there an estate in reversion, which means it goes back to the original grantor. An estate in reversion goes back to the original grantor.
Excuse me, maybe like examples or questions do you have, like a test?
I'll put some questions on that together and get it to everybody tomorrow, like I did for these last night's class today. Okay, so I'll put some together.
The example you just mentioned, the life estate, could she change the regulation related to this life estate?
She
so
could
that-
sell her life estate. So the old lady who was in the nursing home, she could have sold life estate to her kids who had the future interest. And then the life estate, the present interest and the future interest would have recombined and it would have been fee simple. In this particular case, she didn't want to do that because she thought she might have a miraculous recovery and she could move back into the house. As a matter of fact, she very quickly passed away. And then her present interest that she had went to her children who had the future interest. So the present and the future recombined and they were able to sell the house and have fee simple ownership. Okay. This is if you've never heard of this stuff before, like it like blows your mind because it's complicated and you wonder, why would anybody do this? But think about the guy in East Brunswick who left the property to East Brunswick and he didn't trust government. I don't trust government. He didn't trust government. He thought they might pull some kind of shenanigans and then sell the property to somebody and make something else out of it. So what he did was he left it with a defeasible fee or a conditional fee that said, East Brunswick, you only own it as long as you use it for education. So now you can't trick me. You can't wait till I'm dead. And now you own the property and you're going to now sell it out to make condos because then you lose ownership. And that's not as uncommon as you think it might be. And again, you need to know it to pass the test because there'll be questions on the test about it. All right, so now we're going to, what if you have a fee simple, a defeasible fee, or a conditional fee type of ownership? What are the methods of owning those types of ownership? Methods of ownership. Okay, so we're going to start out, and the book does this quite often. I apologize, but sometimes that's the way they have to do it. We're going to define things from different directions. So we're going to define the most usual types of ownership. And the most usual types of ownership are severalty, tenancy in common, joint tenancy, and tenants by the entirety. And I understand how confusing this is because for ownership, they're using the words tenancy. And in your brain, immediately you see tenancy, you think lease, but that's not what tenancy means. Tenancy means duration. So these are fee simple ownerships as tenants in common, fee simple ownerships as joint tenancy, fee simple ownerships as tenants by the entirety. So we're going to define what each of these are. There will be questions on the test about these, multiple questions. and I'll include them in the quiz that I create for these two chapters tonight. First one is severalty. And there's that word sever again. Like when you convert real property to personal property by cutting it, you're severing it. When you own a property in severalty, same root word, sever, you cut yourself off from all others and own it on your own. Own it by yourself. Severalty is one owner. You cut yourself off from all others and own it by yourself. And remember, we said a hereditament is something you can inherit. So ownership in severalty is something you can inherit. If you own in severalty, you can put it in your will that when you die, your kids own it. So it is a hereditament. Severalty is one owner. The next form of ownership is tenants in common. And again, this is going to confuse you. Tenants in common is a form of ownership. And what tenants in common means is there's more than one owner. And it means that all the owners have equal rights of possession. All the owners can go anywhere they want on the property. All the owners have equal rights of possession. And tenants in common is a hereditament. If you're filling out a sales contract and you put more than one owner on it, the presumptive form of preparing the deed is tenants in common. So if you have more than one person on the contract, the attorneys will automatically make it as tenants in common. Why? Because the next ones have special requirements. So if my wife's name is Lee, L-E-E, that could be a man's name, it could be a woman's name. My name is Bruce. So if we put on a sales contract, Bruce and Lee Parker, the attorneys would prepare the deed as tenants in common because it's the presumptive form of ownership unless we ask specifically for something else. And it is a hereditament, which means if three people got together and they bought a property and this guy dies, the guy on the right dies, his will can send his property wherever it wants. He could give his property to his kids if he wanted. He could give his property to his girlfriend if he wanted. He could give his property to his mother if he wanted. It is a hereditament. It can be put in his will. So tenants in common is a hereditament. It can be put in a will. The next kind of ownership is a little more complicated. It's called joint tenancy, also called joint tenancy with rights of survivorship. The important thing in joint tenancy is that it has to have what's called the 4 unities. And the 4 unities are time, title, possession, and interest. It has to have unities of time, title, possession, and interest. All the owners have to come into title at the same time. All the owners have to have the same degree of title, fee simple or defeasible fee or life estate, all the same degree of title. All the owners have equal rights of possession. Any one of them can go anywhere they want on the property. And all the owners have equal shares. So if you have 4 owners, they always each have 25%. If you have 3 owners, they all have 33%. If you have 2 owners, they have 50%. And then for purposes of the test, they're going to walk you through a process. They're going to start you out with 4 owners. Each of these 4 owners, because we have 4 unities and the last one is interest, each of these 4 owners owns 25%. Each of these 4 owners owns 25%. And we're going to start out with the guy here on the right, and we're going to kill him off. When we kill this guy on the right off, his share goes to his surviving partners. So we kill him off. Everybody owned 25%. We kill him off. Now the 3 people who were his partners each own 33%. Even if the guy who we just killed even if his will says he wants his thing to go to his son, it does not go because it is not a hereditament. Tenancy, joint tenancy with rights of survivorship is not a hereditament. All right, so we've killed off guy number one. Now there's three, they each own 33%. Now we're going to kill the person off on the left. Now these two surviving owners each owned 50%. So we went from 4 guys owning 25% each to 3 guys owning 33% to 2 guys owning 50%. And now we're going to kill off the guy on the right again. And when we kill off the guy on the right again, his ownership share goes to his partner. And now the partner owns 100%. And if the partner owns 100%, they have cut themselves off from all others and they own in severalty again. And once you own in severalty again, it does become a hereditament. Once you own in severalty again, you could put it in your will once it becomes a hereditament again. Okay. Now there's other things that can happen. I know this is confusing, but we got to go through it. There's other things that can happen. We have 4 owners. And this owner here says, hey guys, I want to break this joint tenancy. Can I sell my share to Bill? So now he sells his share to Bill. The other 3 have to approve. The other 3 have to approve. That means Bill now owns 25%. And these guys, as a joint tenancy, each own 33%. So now if this little guy dies, these 2 now get his share, and what's left is 75%. So now they each own 37.5%. But Bill still owns 25. Okay, so if that were to happen, if that was the choice people made, everybody has to agree. But let's say this person finds out they're going to die. And they say, listen, I want to break this joint tenancy because if I die, I want my share to go to my kids, not to you guys. They could say no. The other joint tenants could say no. And then the guy who knows he's going to die, he could do a suit for partition. And the court may or may not break up the joint tenancy. Now, I've been running these classes for 25 years. I've had everything passed through my hands. A young lady was in class. Her father owned a butcher store in Brooklyn with a butcher store on the bottom and 4 apartments on top. And the father owned the butcher store with his partner, who was a butcher. The problem is these 2 butchers owned the property as joint tenants. So the girl in class came to me with a will because her father passed away during class, not in class, but during class. And in the will, the father had left my girl in class his 50% ownership. But when she came to me, she said, there's a problem because my lawyer is saying I'm not getting anything. So I looked at her deed, and her deed said joint tenancy with rights of survivorship. And since her deed says, since not her deed, but her father's deed said joint tenancy with rights of survivorship, that means when her father died, his share went to the surviving partner. And so now the surviving partner owned 100%. And even though her father's will had said, you're getting my share, she's not getting his share. That building was worth millions of dollars. A 4-family with a butcher store downstairs in Brooklyn, millions of dollars. She said, what can I possibly do? Well, it's too late for a suit for partition. So I said, the only thing you could probably do is go and beg the partner and say to the partner, hey, please, can I have my father's share? And she did. And he said no. So why would the 2 butchers have done this to start with? Well, the reason the 2 butchers did this to start with is the butcher shop, the business, was more important than the apartments and the building. And they wanted to make sure that if one butcher died, the other butcher could continue on the business. So that's the way they set it up. It was a mistake. They should have never set it up that way. And it set them up for a situation like this happening. And this is also very common. And this is why, if you have more than one owner, they never give you this form of ownership unless you ask for it, because it is the more restrictive form of ownership and it is not a hereditament. So it's dangerous. Now, why might you own this way? Well, there's other reasons. When Bill Clinton was president, Bill Clinton signed a law called the Defense of Marriage Act. And what Bill Clinton said was, we're not going to recognize gay marriages on a federal level. And we're going to find out in a minute that in New Jersey, there's certain protections for a married couple on ownership. But if you were a same-sex couple, and we didn't have legal marriage of same-sex couples in New Jersey when Bill Clinton was president, then you didn't get these protections that we're going to talk about next. So the way you would protect yourself in the event that you, and it's just one of the reasons to use it, just one, not every reason, is if you were a same-sex couple and you wanted to make sure that when one of the couple died, that the way that the estate would be treated would be similar to the way married couples were treated under federal law, you would do a joint tenancy with rights of survivorship. Now, the Supreme Court, while Trump was president, overturned the Defense of Marriage Act, and now same-sex marriage is legal on a federal level, which means this is not quite so important for that purpose. There's other purposes to do this, but it's not quite so important for that purpose. But that was a big deal. That was the way you would protect your partner in a same-sex marriage when same-sex marriages were not recognized by the government. The last form of ownership we're talking about is, make sure on the right slide, tenants by the entirety. Tenants by the entirety is between husband and wife. And this is an old concept from Old English common law, that once you get married, instead of being two people, you were one entity. That's why it's called tenants by the entirety, because you're one entity when you get married. And what this form of ownership does is, back in the olden days, and I'm talking about the 1960s and before, even into the 70s and before, most real property was owned by men with not the woman's name, because women couldn't get loans. And we'll learn about that when we do the chapter on financing and the chapter on federal laws. Women were not able to get loans to buy houses. So the house was typically in the man's name. And if the man died, what would protect the woman in her ownership? If you were married prior to 1978, you were protected by tenants by the entirety. So that if your spouse died, there was an automatic transfer of his share to you. And whether it was the husband dying or the wife's dying, it still transferred the share. And it created an automatic life estate. Now, in 1978, they started fooling around with changing the law. And a little bit later on, they changed it to community property. So we no longer call it tenants by the entirety. Usually we call it community property, but for the test, you're going to have to remember tenants by the entirety. Tenants by the entirety is husband and wife. The wife's right to the property if her husband dies is called the dower, D-O-W-E-R, like a dowry, the dower right. And the husband's right to the property if the wife dies is called the courtesy right. And again, in 1982, I think it was changed to community property. And because there was a period of time between 78 and 82 or 86, whatever the period was, there was the law was in progress and in process. They have a thing called the elective share, the augmented elective share, but we'll talk about that later on in a different chapter when we get to dower and curtsy. Again, remember the dower right is the wife's right if the husband dies, and the husband's right if the wife dies is called the curtsy right. So this is not exactly a hereditament either, because if the husband dies and you're married, he can't automatically leave his share to somebody other than his wife. Another way that you can own properties, another way, is to transfer the ownership of the property to a trust and have the trust own the property. One of the questions on the test is, who are the three people in a trust? Well, the three people in a trust are the trustor, the trustee, and the beneficiary. The three people in a trust are the trustor, the trustee, and the beneficiary. And you can create a trust with a deed, or you can create a trust with a will. And there's different kinds of trusts. The normal legal assumption is that a trust can last for 99 years after the death of a person who created it by will. And again, when we used to have these incredibly high inheritance taxes, the way you would not have an inheritance, but still could control your money, was to put your money into a trust so that when you died, it didn't count as you died. We may see that come back a little bit as they change some of the inheritance laws and start making that inheritance tax a higher percentage. Okay, now we're going to talk about how do businesses own property. And they can. One way is by sole proprietorship, and that would mean you own it in your own name. You're going to buy a rental property and put it in your own name. What is the problem with putting it in your own name? And I hope you see the slide that says ownership by business entities. The problem with putting it in your own name is you have unlimited liability. And as an example, my sister owned a house in New York State. And my sister, it always snows upstate New York. Like it starts snowing now and doesn't stop snowing until June. And on the front porch of her house, the Federal Express driver was delivering a package and he fell down her front porch, the steps, I think there was 8 steps, and he really messed up his back. And he sued my sister for $2 million. My sister owned this property as a sole proprietorship. The trouble is her homeowner's insurance is only for $1 million. And so if he were to have won his suit, they would have gone after the homeowner's insurance and gotten the $1 million, and then they would have sued my sister for the other $1 million. So you have unlimited liability when you own under your own name. How do you avoid the unlimited liability when you own it under your own name? You can own it in a general partnership. A general partnership is when you still have control. You can own it in a limited partnership. In a limited partnership, you do not have control, and your role may be just putting money in. And in a limited partnership, the Securities and Exchange Commission may consider it to be a security, and therefore you need a Series 7 license to sell it. General partnership, again, you have unlimited liability. You could be sued for more than you put into the partnership. In a limited partnership, you can only be sued for your investment into the partnership. You're limited to how much you can be sued for. Another way to not have unlimited liability is to have a corporate ownership. And there's several different kinds of corporations, a C chapter, an S chapter, and an LLC. So the slide should say corporate ownership. In a C chapter corporation, very, very good insulation in a C chapter corporation. The disadvantage of a C chapter corporation is there is an aspect of double taxation. A C chapter corporation has dividends, which have a taxation, and those dividends then have an income, which has a taxation. So there's a double taxation. Another form of corporate ownership is an S chapter corporation, or an LLC. These are known as pass-through corporations. You have your gross income, you subtract all of your expenses, what's left passes through as your income. And S-chapter corporations and LLCs still give you excellent insulation from personal liability if they are created correctly and you follow all the corporation rules. So corporate ownership, what's the disadvantage of a C? Double taxation. Other forms of ownership, again, general and limited partnerships, syndicates, REITs, and joint ventures. All of these have varying participations by different players, except for REITs. REITs are a very special beast. An REIT is a real estate investment trust. This is like a mutual fund for real estate. And this type of ownership, you buy shares in a REIT. And you look in the Wall Street Journal, they're traded, you can watch the shares. Most shopping centers and most malls are owned by REITs. What are the disadvantages of REITs? A REIT has to distribute 90% of its profit every year. So you don't get to have a compounding of value. A REIT has to have 75% of its income come from passive sources like rents. That's why shopping centers and malls are typically owned by REITs. In order to have a REIT, you need to have 100 or more qualified investors, qualified under the Securities and Exchange Commission's regulations for qualification. And in a REIT, you can't have 5 people or less owning more than 50%. And that's to keep a very small number of people from controlling the REIT. Now, since REITs have to have their income from passive sources, REITs sometimes are a good place to borrow money. And again, most shopping centers and most malls are owned by real estate investment trusts. All right, the next form of ownership is condominiums. Condominiums are truly misunderstood. So their slide should say other forms of multiple ownership, condominiums. And everything you see on this slide is a condominium. Whether it's an apartment that's in one of these high rises, whether it's a boat slip can be a condominium. What kind of rights would you get on a boat slip? Either riparian or littoral, but it could be a condominium. Out on Route 33 in Millstone, there's little garages that are condominiums for workshops. And a townhouse complex could be a condominium. It could also be a fee simple form of ownership, but it could be a condominium. So the question is, what makes these things condominiums? So let's pretend we have a piece of land and we buy that piece of land. We're going to get a meets and bounds description on our deed, a meets and bounds description on our master deed. And now we're going to condoize that piece of land by building a high rise there with 100 condos in it. Each of those condos is going to have a lot and block number. Each of those boat slips is going to have a lot and block number. Each of those garages is going to have a lot and block number. And they're all going to have reference to the master deed. The deed that you get for the condo is a unit deed. And the concept of owning a condo is basically you're owning from the walls in. You're owning the airspace. And think about this for a second. If you're owning your condos from the walls in and the airspace, who owns the hallways? Who owns the parking lot? Well, those are owned by the condo association. And everybody who owns a condo then is a tenant in common owner of the common areas. You know, those two words common don't mean the same thing. Tenants in common owner of the common areas. Common areas are like the stairways and the elevators. Tenants in common is a specific type of ownership that we talked about. And what does tenants in common have that's important? It has equal rights of possession. So if all of the owners are tenants in common for the hallways, it means all of the owners have equal rights to be in the hallways. So again, a condo has a master deed for the whole project. Your unit has a unit deed with a lot and block number, and it refers to the master deed. What allows these to be done? What allows you to have condos? And what allows you to have condos is the Condominium Act of 1969 and the Horizontal Property Act. Think about this. Condos aren't that old. 1969. They were invented in Brooklyn. So a condo has a unit deed. It has a reference to a master deed. It has a homeowners association. It probably has bylaws. There's a condominium map. They were created by the Horizontal Property Act and the Condominium Act of 1969. That's what a condominium is. Does it matter what it looks like? No. It can look like an apartment. It can look like a boat slip. It can look like a garage, or it can look like a townhouse. The next form of ownership is a co-op. And I don't like co-ops. When you own a co-op, you own shares of stock in a co-op corporation. Shares of stock in a co-op corporation, and your stock shares are proportional to how big your unit is compared to how big the whole thing is. And you own a proprietary lease. That proprietary lease gives you the top priority to live in your unit. So what don't you see there? You don't see a deed. When you own a co-op, you don't have a deed. You have shares of stock and you have a proprietary lease. So one of the questions that comes up on the test is, in the event that you have a closing and you're reading your closing statement and there is a stock transfer fee, in other words, a charge for transferring stock shares, what did you just buy? Well, you just bought a co-op, because somehow you've got to pay to transfer those shares of stock that you own. Are you going to get a deed? No. If you own a co-op, do you pay taxes to the town? No. You pay a homeowner's fee to the association, to the co-op corporation, and the co-op corporation pays the taxes. But you don't pay the taxes directly to the town because you don't have a deed. Right? Co-ops. The next form of ownership is timeshares. Timeshares were created by the Timeshare Act. Timeshares are also known as vacation ownership, interval ownership, and they can be deeded or they can be leasehold. So you might own, if you're lucky, you're going to own the 52nd week down at Disney. That's the week between Christmas and New Year's when everybody's off from school. I hate timeshares because you can't get out of them. If you can't sell it and the fees go up really high, there's nothing you can do. You're stuck. They can hound you forever. So a timeshare, you might own 1 week. They now have timeshares, by the way, that they're selling on luxury homes that you get an 8-week period of ownership on these luxury homes. Timeshares can be deeded. If your timeshare is deeded, it means you get the same unit every time you have your week or your month. And they can also be leasehold. If they're leasehold, what it means is you get some unit somewhere in the complex or somewhere maybe in another complex for that week. Deeded means you get the same unit every time. Leasehold means you're just going to get a unit somewhere. And then the Timeshare Act also has a loophole. One of the questions that's very important on the test is, who can pay you? Only your employing broker. Who can pay somebody for a real estate related activity? Only their employing broker, except with a timeshare. With a timeshare company can pay a referral to a non-licensed person, except in New Jersey, they cannot pay that referral in money. So let's say you own a timeshare down at Seaview outside of Atlantic City. Seaview says that if you bring your brother down there and your brother buys a timeshare, Seaview will pay you a free week anywhere in their whole world inventory of timeshares. So they're paying you for referring your brother, even if you're not licensed, but they're not paying you in money. They're giving you a free week. So the non-licensed person can be paid, but they can't be paid in money. And those are timeshares. All right, that brings us to our last slide and a couple of 5 quick questions, which you guys can read over for a second, and then we'll go over them. These 2 chapters have a lot of test questions on them on the test. We fixed my recording problem. Tonight's class went perfectly. So I will re-record this class, even though I sent you a previous chapter 4 and 5 recording. I'll re-record this, I'll re-edit this class tonight, and I will create some questions on one of those class marker, the app I have where I sent you questions today, where you can take the test, it'll grade it, take the quiz, it'll grade it, and it'll tell you the right answers. So again, more resources to help you pass. All right, so question number 1, which of the following statements is true? Now, these are tough questions because you got to read everything. So let's read them. Number A, in a condominium, unit owners host shares of stock which serve as evidence of ownership. That's not true. In a condominium, you get a deed. Number B is in a co-op, a master deed is recorded. That's not true, because in a co-op, you don't have a deed, you get shares of stock. Number C is just a baloney thing they put in there. And let's just pretend when you read C, you had no idea, because you're looking for the true statement. So let's say when you read C, you have no idea, and it is just a baloney statement. So now we're going to read D. The tenant owner in a co-op does not have fee simple ownership. And we know that's the truth because the tenant occupant has shares of stock and a proprietary lease. So somebody's asking, how do you get to the recordings? I emailed recordings out. We're still working on getting the recordings onto my Best School of Real Estate webpage. And you can still find me on YouTube under Bruce Parker Realtor. And we've got a lot of the recordings already on there. So a couple of different ways, but we will eventually have them where they're going to open within my Best School of Real Estate.biz website. So you could just go on there and find them on there and read them on there. All right, number 2, in New Jersey, condominiums are regulated by, and we said the condominiums were created by the Condominium Act and the Horizontal Property Act. So our answer is going to be C, the Horizontal Property Act. 3, the occupancy rights of an owner in a co-op. Remember, in a co-op, you get shares of stock and a proprietary lease. So your occupancy rights are based on your proprietary lease in a co-op. Number 4 is Alan, Joan, and Tony own 25, 35, and 40%. How do they own it? So first of all, there's 3 of them. So we know this is not Utah, so you can only be married to one person. So they have to not be tenants by the entirety because there's 3 of them. So they can't be tenants by the entirety. There's 3 of them. So they can't be tenants in severalty, or they can't be owning in severalty, because severalty means you cut yourself off from all others and own by yourself. So they can't be severalty. They own 25, 35, and 40%. So they do not have the unity of interest, which means they violate the joint tenancies requirement to have the 4 unities: time, title, possession, and interest. So it's not going to be joint tenants. And that leaves us with one choice: tenants in common. And again, it's because they're not equal shares, so they can't be joint tenants. And number 5, which of the following is not one of the 4 unities of joint tenancy? And remember, it's time, title, possession, and interest. So which one is not one of those? Equity.
Equity.
Okay. All right. So that's it for tonight. Everybody can start getting ready for their Thanksgiving tomorrow. Everybody, I hope, has a happy Thanksgiving. I have a whole day where my wife kicks me out of the house so she can get everything ready. And I will work on some quizzes for you guys and work on editing tonight's recording so that you can play it at your leisure. Instead of watching football tomorrow night, you can watch the recording, hopefully. If you have any questions, if you see the tests come through your email, take it and let me know, what you think about it. It's a new app I bought, Class Marker, and we're going to see how it works out. I think it'll work better for everybody. These two chapters are very important. A lot of questions on the test. They're also very important in real life because, you're going to come across almost everything we talked about at some point when you work real estate. All right.
I have one question, Bruce.
Sure.
The most common ownership, is it joint tenant?
No, tenants in common by far.
Okay, so the married couple is if they buy a property, it's the ownership is tenants in common.
So I'm going to give you a very simplistic legal chain of events, but very simplistic. One of the things about the ownership of real property under the Community Property Act is if a piece of real estate is your principal primary residence, no matter whose name is on the deed, the other spouse automatically gets a half share ownership. Okay. So as an example, in 1978, I bought a house with my first wife. The house was in my name. When we got divorced, she wanted half the value of the house, and I ended up having to give it to her because she had an automatic half interest in the house that was our principal primary residence, even though it was in my own name. Now, we also had 18 rental properties that were in my name. We had never lived in any of those 18 properties. They were all in my name. I paid for them all. I managed them all. And when we got divorced, now the question became, did she have any ownership interest in those properties? The 18. And every time I went to sell one of the 18, the buyer's title insurance company wanted to make sure that my ex-wife didn't have a dower claim to those properties that were in my name. And what would have made the claim is if we had lived in them as their principal marital residence. So every time I went to sell one of those 18, they had to get proof that my wife never lived there. And the way they got proof was I would have to go to my ex-wife and ask her to sign a quit claim deed. And you guys that have been around long enough are going to remember a quit claim deed does not have a covenant of season. In a quit claim deed, the grantor is not saying they have any ownership. They're just promising, they're quitting, they're just promising they will never bring a claim of ownership. So every time I went to sell one of those 18 rental properties that was in my name, that I owned during my marriage to my first wife, we had to prove she didn't live in them. And the way we proved that was she would sign a quit claim deed, which would mean she would promise the guy who was buying it from me, she would never bring a claim that she lived in it. And the unfortunate part was every time I asked her to sign that quit claim deed, she wanted money. So it cost me a fortune. So again, if you're married, and married is the key in New Jersey, you have to be married. If you're married and the house is in your wife's name, is in the wife's name, and the husband and wife live in it, he automatically has a half share to the house under community property. And if you were married prior to 1978, under dower and courtesy right. All right, I hope that explained it.
Thanks.
Okay. A funny thing happens, and only guys do this. I have had once every 2 years, a guy will come to me and say, I want to hurry up and buy a house. And I say, okay, that's great for me. Why are you in a hurry? Well, because I'm getting married in June and I want to buy it before I get married. So if I decide to get rid of my wife, she doesn't get half the house. And only guys do this. I've never had a girl do this. And I have to tell them, well, listen, you can do that, but if you buy that house and you and her get married and move into it, she's a half owner. So you better probably do the right thing. And if you're going to get married and you're going to live in it, you're going to have to just remember that she's going to be a half owner. You might as well make her a half owner so you can start out your marriage on the right foot. Of course, if you buy it and you never move into it, and she never contributes to any of the maintenance or pays any of the mortgage, then it could stay as a non-community property. But you'd have to prove that she never put any money in and you kept all the accounts completely separate. Very complicated. And that's why divorce lawyers make a lot of money, because solving all this stuff is very complicated. Any other questions? That was a good one. If you have a timeshare and you want to get rid of it, there's guys who specialize in terminating timeshares. They're very difficult to do. The guys who advertise on the radio are the best at it. And if you have a timeshare, I would get rid of it. I really think, it's nice if you have kids and you have a timeshare in Disney and every Christmas you go to Disney. But when the kids get grown, what are you going to do with that timeshare? So, and as the timeshare gets ugly and old, and there's new ones all around that are nicer, what are you going to do with it? So again, never, ever buy a timeshare. And if you have one, go ahead.
But you do the timeshare with a limited time, like 10 years or 20 years.
They don't sell that I know of. I don't know that they sell it with a limited time frame. That would be nice if they did, but I don't know if they do. And these new ones that sell you a 1/8 interest in luxury property, that sounds like it's great, but what happens 30 years from now if you went out? They say they let you out of it a little bit more easily, but I don't know that that's the case. And it's something that just got started. I think it's called Picasso that sells you timeshares a month, 1/8 timeshares in 1/8 timeshares in luxury properties, big expensive houses. All right, interest rates are fluctuating a little bit. The Treasury auction, the interest rates on treasuries went up a little. That means we should see interest rates on mortgages go up a little in the next couple of weeks. New housing starts today. We're at 700,000 a year. In good years, when the housing market is great, it's 1 million a year. So the good news is we probably have a couple of years to go on a good housing market. Some of the disturbing things that they announced today was that rents have gone up nationwide, an average of 13%. And in Florida, California, and New Jersey, who are leading the country, rents have gone up 30%. So 13% nationwide as an average, 30% in these states. That means it is going to be virtually impossible for people to afford rents anymore. And it's going to be even harder for people to afford to buy. So the only thing that can solve that is inflation, where everybody starts making more money. And I've been through 3 different, because I'm old enough, 3 different timeframes of inflation, including when Gerald Ford was president. And Gerald Ford put wage and price controls in effect in the country. Couldn't raise prices and you couldn't raise wages. Everybody used to wear these little buttons that said WIN. That was Gerald Ford's, President Biden is saying build better back or build back better. President Ford had WIN, which was WIC inflation now, because inflation was so bad. And interest rates on houses, if you went to buy a house, they maxed out at 19% at one point. Imagine that, getting a 19% mortgage on your house. So again, we got a couple good years to go. So we're going to hurry and get our licenses. And we got a couple good years that we can benefit from. New Jersey is always better than other states in the long run. We maintain our values better because we have a better educated population, and we have access to New York and Philadelphia, and we have good infrastructure in terms of trains. And we're an entry point for people coming in from all over the world. So New Jersey is always a good state to do real estate in. It doesn't have the highest appreciation and it doesn't have the lowest depreciation. All right. Turkeys went up in price this year. So unless you got a free one, you paid extra. But everybody enjoyed their turkey day. And let's see, we got one more question maybe on the chat. Oh, it's a happy Thanksgiving from Geraldo. You guys all do have a good vacation and we'll see you on Tuesday. I'll send you out some more quizzes and tests and try to give you some more recordings and link you to where the recordings kind of hide. That's it for tonight. Goodbye, everybody, and have a very nice Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving. Thank you.
All right, bye-bye.
Hi, good night.
30，那正常人就崩了。